and I'm very pleased to be able to be here today and to speak to all of you. And my talk is entitled, More Than a Mixture of Roaring Polemics and Plotting Statistics, Reassessing Hinton Rowan Helper and the Impending Crisis of the South, How to Meet It. Never since Faust, the first printer's league with the devil, the Cleveland plain deal at Chortle, has there been anything bound in calf that has so stirred up the bile of half a nation as Helper's book. It has taken the place of the business of the whole nation at Washington and brought the government to a dead stand. The language was overwrought, but the sentiments were correct. An edited version of Hinton Rowan Helper's The Impending Crisis of the South, How to Meet It, had brought the business of the government to a standstill and had inflamed the already prominent tensions between North and South. Earl Schenck Myers agreed with the plain dealer and declared that Helper's book was like a lighted match thrown into a powder keg, rocking both the North and South with its explosive force, and the tremors it released came close to toppling the 36th Congress. George Frederickson found Helper's opus the most important single book in terms of political impact that has ever been no Republican, and you have failed to implicate a single Republican in his Harper's Ferry enterprise. But we also know, many historians have shown us, that Lincoln's relationship with John Brown was far more complex than this fragment would suggest. In a speech at Elwood, Kansas, December 1st, 1859, one day before Brown's execution, Lincoln says that John Brown had declared great courage, rare unselfishness, and as even Governor Wise testifies, but no man, North or South, can approve of violence or crime. So what we have here is a basic dual mindset. On the one hand, Brown used deplorable means. On the other hand, he worked toward a common goal. And this sort of dual mindset, it was very common throughout the Republican Party, and it absolutely infuriated Southerners. Because most Republicans professed some sort of admiration for Brown, if not his goals, the Southerners would then interpret their condemnation of Brown's violence as insincere and duplicitous. On the other hand, what has always struck me as interesting, if Republicans felt compelled to denounce Brown's violence, they did not seem to have a problem with Helper's. And the impending crisis was filled with violent language and the threat of a rebellion by non-slave-holding white men. So Helper concluded his book with this ominous warning. If, in these or any other similar cases, the oligarchs do not quietly submit to the will of a constitutional majority of the people, as expressed at the ballot box, the first battle between freedom and slavery will be fought at home, and may God defend the right. So here, Helper's threatening a rebellion of lower-class white people and violence against the slave oligarchy, which is striking at the foundations of master race democracy. In addition, he threatened the South with the specter of a slave rebellion, and this is something that had frightened Southerners for decades, stretching all the way back to the rebellion in Saint Domingue. And while the case might be made that Helper's violence was confined to a book, the reaction of many Southerners, burning copies of the book and driving Helper out of the South, would suggest that they recognized the power, influence, and potential of his words. So, despite these violent passages, Republicans embraced Helper's impending crisis. And here's what's really critical. They prepared a shorter version, which they called the Compendium, with several passages altered or removed, for publication as a campaign document. And you might be thinking, well, if Republicans are so opposed to violence, one might be forgiven for suspecting that, oh, the omitted passage would have been the violent one. That's not the case. So the inflammatory closing line was retained, and out of 12 alterations, only one concerned violent rhetoric. So a passage where Helper wrote, "Do you aspire to become the victims of white non-slaveholding vengeance by day and of barbarous massacres by the Negroes at night? Would you be instrumental in bringing upon yourselves, your wives, and your children a fate too horrible to contemplate?" was omitted. And yes, you might say this is a very inflammatory passage. He's advocating servile insurrection. But you also want to remember that Republicans are preparing a shorter version of the book. They're not buying up and destroying all extant copies. And furthermore, all other altered passages concerned a variety of different themes. So for one, the compilers toned down the stridency of Helper's abolitionism to try and appeal to a wider swatch of the Republican base. They removed 2 passages attacking Thomas Ritchie and omitted some of the passages insulting Southern honor, although, as we'll see, they left others in. But indeed, one could state from the number of changes made from what I've just described that the Republicans putting together the compendium were less concerned about Helper's violent rhetoric than in making sure they did not insult the already dead Thomas Ritchie. And furthermore, the fact that so many Republicans embraced Helper in the Impending Crisis, despite this violent rhetoric and inherent violence of the book, suggests that scholars need to think harder about the importance of violence in Republican ideology and a theme that is in desperate need of reevaluation, I contend, violence in politics. So while Helper biographers Fredrickson, Bailey, and Brown dutifully discuss the contemporary debates linking Helper and Brown, most Brown biographers assess the links between the two men in a somewhat superficial fashion. And this is problematic because historians have long overlooked the implications of this comparison for the study of Republican ideology. So Eric Foner, who is the most prominent student of Republican ideology before the Civil War, did not fully probe the links between Republican ideology and violence, but rather explored the usage by Republicans of the ideas of violence, Southern rowdyism, and Southern bullying as conscious political strategies. And Foner will make assertions to the fact that Southern Republicans found it effective to blame the South for mob violence directed against their freedom of speech. William Gannap's magisterial book, The Origins of the Republican Party, ably analyzed ways that Republicans utilized violence in Kansas as a potentially powerful political issue that could be used to build a sectional anti-slavery party, but like Foner, Gannap did not fully explore the function of violence in Republican thought. Michael Holt, another, well, possibly the most important political historian of this generation, offered the same analysis and again explored how Republicans used violence, but not the links between violence and Republican ideology. And there are some other books that do this as well. So basically, the historians that I've mentioned are focusing on how Republicans set themselves up in opposition to Southern bullying and used violence in the territories or violence directed against Republicans as tools to build a political party. And thus, largely missing is the relationship between Republican ideology and the violence advocated by Helper and Brown. Now, the fact that this violence has been alive, Fredrickson found Helper useful because he saw him as out of the ordinary. And Fredrickson said, by showing the logical extremes of American racism and something of its origin, his career reveals sources of contamination and shows how the disease itself, if not properly treated, can warp the mind of an individual or a society. But reducing Helper to an aberration would seem to me to obscure his connections with his contemporaries. Furthermore, Helper in his book demonstrate far more about whether he was typical or atypical. The linkages between Helper and Brown should spur historians to think harder about violence, Republican ideology, and thought. The Impending Crisis beckons historians toward a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of nativism and gendered language in antebellum America. And finally, the Helper-Hedrick comparison, I think, sheds some light about the experience of dissenters, which we have seen were obviously a very important group in North Carolina history, and should allow for deeper and richer analysis of Helper and his world. And thank you very much for your kind attention.